All right, thank you, Mr. Gibson. And now words from Ms. Valentine Rugwabiza, Deputy Director General of the WTO. Ma'am, the session started with the premise that first, trade is an indispensable and important part of food security. We all understand that trade policy alone does not by itself and cannot provide all the answers to the challenges faced by the agriculture sector. So, in your opinion, how has, and this is a broad question, how has trade liberalization, whether in the multilateral context or in a regional context, contributed to improving the efficiency of commodity supply chains? Ma'am.
Excuse me. Yeah, my question has not been interpreted correctly.
I'm sorry, sir. Can you restate and?
Yeah, my
but
question.
Can we hold it till Ms. Valentine?
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
please. Thank you. You'll be first.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dalton. Your starting point is the correct one. Trade is not sufficient, but is nevertheless an indispensable element of the food security. And why is it the case? Because in food security, two key elements. We look at the accessibility of food and then the affordability of food. And both for the accessibility and food affordability, trade plays a central role. Now, I would like to touch on four elements mainly, just to illustrate why and how trade plays a central role, be it trade liberalization, as you said, as organized at global level through the multilateral trading system, or as is happening at regional level through Asian or through a few other regional trade agreements. Those four elements, I will touch first of all on the agriculture policy. Agriculture policies played a central role in food security. And by agriculture policy, the role of trade is to really be the transmission belt between the demand and the supply. And the more barriers, the more disruptions you put in that transmission belt, the more difficult you make food availability or food accessibility. The more expensive you make food as well. So agricultural policies matter here. And by agricultural policies, the type of tariff imports, for example, the barrier that a country will put in place, that will increase food prices to the final consumers. Another example will be agriculture export restrictions. And we have seen a very damaging example of that, for example, during the food crisis in 2008. If you remember, just listening with a lot of interest to our colleague from Thailand, rice is such a staple food for millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. And hundreds of millions of people, for example, in Africa, depend very much on rice that is produced in Asia, on rice that is produced in Thailand. Now, with this dependence, you have only 7% of rice world production that is traded, only 7%. So it is a commodity that is very thinly traded. And how that crisis happened, it is a country that I will not name, that was not Thailand, it started imposing export restriction to rice export, and it triggered, of course, few other producers to put export restrictions to protect the supply of rice to their own population. And you can imagine what kind of insecurity it brought to a number of countries that are very much dependent on imports for their own food security. At the time in 2008, We saw a number of riots in a number of countries, in a number of African countries due to that. So the policies that are used matter, and they are very important. A second element I would like to touch on is trade facilitation. We discussed a lot trade facilitation yesterday. We didn't have the time really to go into the details of trade facilitation. But by trade facilitation, we mean very much the regulations, what kind of regulations are put in place at borders, and are they transparent? Is the information available? Are those regulations changed without prior consultations? All that has a bearing on food prices. But also, what are the delays that are imposed on importers and exporters? Remember that food is perishable. And while we speak of food insecurity, let's remember that still 30% of the food that is produced in the world goes to waste. And part of that has to do with the delays that are imposed. So trade facilitation is also an essential element of food security. It contributes to food security. And having ease of moving food, not only in a country, but across borders, is an important element for the food security and accessibility. I was reading in a paper yesterday, in a paper yesterday an interview by the CEO of Olam, and I was pretty shocked to read that. Well, he makes 65% of his profit. They are in commodities. He makes 65% of his profit between the farm and the port. That's not normal. That's not normal. I mean, good for him, good for his business, but that's not normal. And I was struck by that, reading that. That's not normal. It means that there are so many roadblocks that are put there that, of course, there are many consequences. But if the policies that are put in place, if the business environment is such that it will facilitate the movement of food, the transport of food, and the movement of food, well, you will also have much more of the benefits coming back to the farmers. A third element I wanted to mention, and which is equally important, has to do with capacity. Capacity, and in terms of capacity here, I will mention just one element. There are many more. There is much more to that than the element I will mention, but one that is very important has to do with standards. What are the food safety standards become sometimes an impediment to food trade. A number of food exporting countries are confronted with standard requirements that they can't always meet. It has to do sometimes with the capacity, simply, to upgrade the capacity to certify. There is another aspect to that, and that has to do with making sure that those standards are sound, those standards are scientifically justified, that those standards have indeed to do with security, safety, ensuring the safety of the consumer, and that they are not disguised barriers to trade. So that is equally an important element. I know that the ITC does a lot of work to help exporters meet those standards, food exporters meet those standards. We have a facility also in the WTO, the Standard of Trade and Development Facility, that helps also exporters meeting those standards. And a fourth element, and that is not all, but just focusing on the trade aspect, a fourth element has to do with finance. I think that finance and finance for commodities is equally an important barrier to food safety and food security. But let me stop at this point, and I'll be more than happy to develop further any of these 4 points.